Omar, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hope it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
So, I know Southcom is an area that you've been watching pretty closely for some time. Tell me, how surprised were you at the actions that were taken overnight on January 3rd with the US military intervention to pull President Nicolás Maduro out of Venezuela?
I will say I wasn't very surprised that an action was taken. After all, it's not very often that you see the readying of a massive, essentially a strike force composed of hundreds of military aircraft, of special operations troops, and helicopters inbound, and of a carrier strike group in a region without using it for some type of thing beyond posturing. I will say, though, from what it appears, the strike itself was relatively unprecedented in terms of it being a massive escalation from merely drone strikes on boats or covert land options that the Trump administration explored in the previous weeks. So in terms of the strike occurring, it wasn't very much of a surprise, but in terms of the timing and scale is definitely unprecedented relative to what we'd seen in the past few months.
What should we understand to kind of set the table about Venezuela geopolitically, the political climate, the military, where this country was going into this ramp up of US action and ultimately intervention?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the context here is really important to understanding both the rationale behind the actions that were taken by President Trump, along with the future of what's to come. So, and to give some context, Venezuela, as you know, is located on the Caribbean. It's extremely rich, as we've heard recently, in oil, but also other natural resources. So they have large deposits of untapped LNG, liquid natural gas. They've got nickel and cobalt, gold and diamonds, and it really is a very critical mineral and oil-rich country in South America. Now, for a while, Venezuela was relatively closely aligned with the United States, but that changed with the entry to power of Hugo Chavez in 1998. He really started to turn the country away from the United States and from the Western system, as it were, and bring it closer to Cuba, particularly along with China and Russia. So you started seeing, the exodus of federal agents and of U.S. personnel from Venezuela. You started to see increasing close ties on trade, on defense, particularly in arms transfers with the Cubans, and that just continued to intensify after Chavez's death in 2013, and as Maduro ascended to the presidency as his successor. Now, the one thing to note about what makes Maduro different from Chavez is Chavez arose with a significant amount of popular fanfare. So he was elected kind of as a populist socialist, if you will, while Maduro only won the election by about 2% margin from his opposition. So ever since Maduro came to power, he's kind of been existentially threatened, if you will, by his opposition. So sometimes the opposition, for example, took control of the parliament. Maduro, instead of trying to figure out their demands, decided to shut down the parliament. If Maduro saw that journalists or protesters were trying to raise their voices against what he was doing, he would crack down on them using his security apparatus, which has also led to a large number of human rights violations in the Maduro regime. So you kind of see an escalation driven by insecurity here, particularly as Maduro's power has continued to be consolidated, which poses a very big threat both to the Venezuelan people, but also because of Venezuela's close relations with Cuba, with Iran, with Russia and China to the United States, and our interest as well.
Now, you discussed in your earlier remarks how this raid operation was somewhat unprecedented. So we talked about the buildup, so the strikes on shipping vessels, and then what President Trump called the blockade around Venezuela. But after that January 3rd operation involving special operations troops, can you walk me through that and what we know about both the planning and the execution of that operation?
For sure. So the planning for this operation, like most operations that involve soft but also large-scale conventional strikes, didn't just happen out of the blue. I mean, the planning stages for this started most likely in late August, early September, in conjunction with that massive buildup of military forces. And in fact, one of the first assets that you saw deployed in theater before the arrival of the amphibious ready groups and the carrier strike groups was a specialized vessel that used primarily by the 160th Special Operations Division in order to facilitate their short-range air assets. And that was one of the first things that arrived in the Caribbean theater as picked up by open source intelligence. So that shows that SOF had a major role to play.
And when you say SOF, you mean Special Operations Forces,
yes,
just to be clear.
Yeah, it showed that they had a major role to play in this arena from pretty much day one of the planning stage. Now, we also saw increasing authorization for covert action as the months dragged on. So you had President Trump authorizing CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to conduct covert action in Venezuela itself, which previously had not been publicly stated, and that then facilitated both the precise targeting that we heard General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, talk about in his press briefing, but also what really allowed the special operators to find, fix, and finish, if you will, or extract Maduro. In addition to that CIA covert action campaign, if you will, that we saw, and the increasing ratcheting up of bringing in more support assets like the strike aircraft, electronic surveillance and electronic warfare aircraft, and of course, again, the carrier strike group. You also heard about President Trump. President Trump mentioned that the Special Operations Forces were training regularly to raid Maduro's compound. If you think about it, it's kind of analogous to what happened during the Osama bin Laden raid and other sort of high-profile SOF missions, is that they'll do an in-depth study of their target and then be able to essentially blitz through it in their sleep. And the only way they can really do that is if they have a good idea of their target's pattern of life, like what they're doing, where they're going, but also about their locations. And that's really where you start to see this sort of whole of government interagency collaboration come together. So naturally you have, your CIA assets on the ground, along with, folks from other intelligence agencies who are providing a better situational picture of communications or of the different types of strike assets that the Venezuelan military has that we need to be able to identify and remove from the picture. You have the folks over at Special Operations Command and Special Operations Command South who are working on liaising those CIA and other intel assets together with our special operators, and then them also liaising with big Navy, big Army, and big Air Force to make sure that they have the overall cover, which, as we saw, they did in order to conduct the operation. And then, of course, we can't forget that the legal justification for this event, and indeed the taking into custody of Maduro by DEA and DHS agents, also brings in that coordination with the Department of Justice and Homeland Security and the Drug Enforcement Agency. So you really just see how big of a web of interagency collaboration is what prompted this effort to go through unscathed.
Is there one agency or element that's coming out looking like the MVP of this operation?
So I'm biased, but I'd have to say SOCOM. I mean, they were the 160th SOAR sent in their air crews, again, under cover of fire and also under fire, as we heard from General Kane, in order to land precisely on Maduro's compound, get the operators and, the DHS folks on the ground, retrieve Maduro, again, under fire from the compound, and exfiltrate with no American casualties, all within a span of, I believe it was under 2.5 hours, which is a pretty quick time to get into completely hostile territory, neutralize enemies on site, and extract a extremely high priority target. So I'd have to say the MVP here is SOCOM, but SOCOM's efforts could not have happened without the rest of the supporting cast.